The morning of July 15th, 2009, started like any other day at Camp Wildwood. Nestled deep in the mountains of North Carolina, counselors prepared for another day of hiking, swimming, and campfire stories. But by sunset, two campers would be missing, and a mystery would begin that would haunt this place for over a decade. What happened to the Henderson twins, and why did it take 12 years for someone to discover the truth hidden inside the walls of Cabin 7? Before we dive into this chilling mystery, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more unexplained disappearances. Camp Wildwood had been a summer tradition for families across the Southeast for nearly 40 years. Parents sent their children to experience nature, build friendships, and create memories that would last a lifetime. The camp sat on 300 acres of pristine wilderness, where ancient oak trees towered above rustic cabins, and a crystal clear lake reflected the surrounding mountains. During peak season, the camp hosted over 200 children aged 8 to 16, divided into age groups and housed in wooden cabins that had been built by hand in the 1970s. The Henderson twins, Marcus and Matthew, were 12 years old when they arrived at Camp Wildwood. For what would be their final summer, the boys were identical in appearance, but completely different in personality. Marcus was outgoing and adventurous, always the first to volunteer for challenging hikes or risky activities. Matthew was quieter, more thoughtful, preferring to read by the lake or study the wildlife around camp. Despite their differences, the twins were inseparable. They shared everything: thoughts, fears, dreams, and secrets that only brothers could understand. Their parents, David and Susan Henderson, had sent the boys to camp, hoping the experience would help them develop independence and confidence. The twins had been homeschooled their entire lives, living on a remote farm in rural Tennessee, where their closest neighbors were miles away. Camp Wildwood represented their first real opportunity to interact with other children their own age and experience life beyond their isolated existence. Susan Henderson had researched dozens of camps before choosing Wildwood, attracted by its reputation for safety and its emphasis on outdoor education. Camp director Robert Walsh had been running Wildwood for 15 years and prided himself on maintaining the highest safety standards. In 20 years of operation, they had never experienced a serious accident or incident. Children occasionally got homesick or had minor injuries, but nothing that couldn't be handled by the camp's medical staff. Walsh personally interviewed every counselor and required extensive background checks before anyone was allowed to work with the children. The camp's safety record was spotless until July 15th, 2009. The twins were assigned to Cabin 7 along with 6 other boys their age. The cabin was located on the eastern edge of the camp property, about a quarter-mile from the main lodge and dining hall. Like all the cabins at Wildwood, it was a simple wooden structure with 8 bunk beds, a small common area, and a counselor's room. Their counselor was 22-year-old Derek Martinez, a college student studying outdoor recreation who had worked at the camp for 3 previous summers. Derek was popular with the kids because of his easygoing nature and his ability to turn any activity into an adventure. That Wednesday morning started with the usual breakfast routine in the dining hall, followed by morning activities. The twins had signed up for a nature photography class taught by the camp's naturalist, Jennifer Kim. The class spent 2 hours hiking through the forest, learning to identify local wildlife and capture images of birds, insects, and plants. Matthew showed particular interest in the photography equipment, asking detailed questions about camera settings and composition. Marcus was more interested in the hiking aspect, constantly pushing ahead of the group to explore new trails. After lunch, the boys participated in swimming lessons at the lake. Both twins were strong swimmers, having learned in the pond on their family's farm. But the camp required all campers to demonstrate their abilities before being allowed in the deeper water. The afternoon passed peacefully, with the twins enjoying free time playing, capture the flag with other campers, and helping with evening meal preparation. They seemed happy and well adjusted, showing no signs of distress or homesickness. Dinner was served at 6:30 in the main dining hall, where all 200 campers and staff gathered for the evening meal. The twins sat with their cabin mates, laughing and sharing stories about their day. Several witnesses later recalled seeing them at dinner, appearing normal and engaged in conversation with other children. The meal ended around 7:15, and campers returned to their cabins for an hour of free time before the evening campfire program. Derek Martinez conducted the routine evening cabin check at 8 o'clock, verifying that all 8 boys were present and accounted for the twins were in their bunks, reading comic books they had brought from home. Derek reminded everyone about the campfire program starting at 8:30 and encouraged them to gather their jackets. Since mountain temperatures could drop quickly after sunset, the twins said they would be ready in a few minutes, and Derek left the cabin to prepare for the evening activities. The campfire program was a beloved tradition at Camp Wildwood, where counselors led songs, told stories, and sometimes organized skits or games. The entire camp community gathered around a large fire pit near the lake, creating a magical atmosphere under the star-filled sky. Attendance was mandatory for all campers, as it served as the final head count of the day, ensuring everyone was safe and accounted for before bedtime. At 8:25, Derek returned to Cabin 7 to escort his campers to the campfire program. He found 6 boys waiting outside the cabin, ready to go, but the Henderson twins were nowhere to be seen. Derek called their names and checked inside the cabin thoroughly, looking under bunks in the bathroom and in the small storage areas. The twins had simply vanished. Their belongings remained in their bunks. Their jackets still hung on the hooks by the door, but Marcus and Matthew were gone. Derek immediately radioed the camp director while instructing the other boys to stay together. Walsh arrived within minutes and quickly organized a search of the immediate area. Other counselors were dispatched to check the dining hall, the arts and crafts building, and the lake shore, thinking the twins might have wandered off or become confused about the evening schedule. But 20 minutes of searching revealed no trace of the boys. By 9 o'clock, Walsh made the decision to cancel the campfire program and implement the camp's emergency procedures. All campers were returned to their cabins under strict supervision, while every available adult joined the search effort. The camp's emergency lighting system was activated, flooding the grounds with bright spotlights. Parents were notified, and local authorities were contacted within an hour of the twins' disappearance. The initial search focused on the most likely scenarios. Perhaps the boys had become lost while exploring the woods, or had fallen into the lake despite being strong swimmers. Accidents could happen in the darkness. Search teams combed the forest trails, Calling the twins' names and listening for any response, boats equipped with powerful searchlights scanned the lake surface, while divers prepared for underwater recovery operations. Sheriff's deputies from the county arrived at 10:30, followed by state police and search and rescue teams. The camp's peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of helicopters circling overhead and the sight of dozens of emergency vehicles lining the access road. News crews began arriving before midnight, drawn by reports of missing children at the popular summer camp. The search continued through the night, with over 100 volunteers joining law enforcement officers in combing every inch of the camp property and surrounding wilderness. Thermal imaging equipment was deployed to detect body heat in the dense forest. Bloodhounds were brought in to track the twins' scent, but the dogs seemed confused, losing the trail near Cabin 7 and unable to pick it up anywhere else on the property. As dawn broke on July 16th, the Henderson twins had been missing for nearly 12 hours. Their parents arrived at the camp after driving through the night from Tennessee. David Henderson was a quiet man who rarely showed emotion, but the strain was visible on his face. Susan Henderson wept openly as she spoke with investigators, pleading for any information about her sons. The family had never been separated before, and the twins had never been away from home for more than a few hours. The investigation revealed several puzzling aspects about the disappearance the twins had left behind, all their personal belongings, including medications that Matthew needed for his asthma. Their beds showed no signs of struggle, and their cabin mates insisted they had heard nothing unusual during the evening. Derek Martinez was questioned extensively about his whereabouts and activities, but his alibi was solid. He had been with other counselors preparing for the campfire program when the twins vanished. Camp Wildwood's security measures were scrutinized by investigators. The facility had no perimeter fencing and relied on natural barriers like dense forest and steep terrain to keep campers safe. There were no security cameras on the property, as Walsh believed they would detract from the camp's rustic atmosphere. The nearest public road was 2 miles away, accessible only by a single dirt path that wound through the mountains. Local residents were interviewed about suspicious activities or strangers in the area, but the region was sparsely populated with few year-round residents. Most properties were vacation cabins used only during summer months, limiting the number of potential witnesses. The nearest town was 15 miles away and had a population of less than 800 people. The FBI was called in after 48 hours, as the case met criteria for possible kidnapping. The federal agents brought additional resources and expertise, but they faced the same challenges that had frustrated local investigators. There was simply no physical evidence to follow, no witnesses to interview, and no clear motive for anyone to harm two 12-year-old boys. Search efforts expanded to cover a 20-mile radius around the camp, involving hundreds of volunteers and costing thousands of dollars in resources. Helicopters equipped with advanced sensors flew grid patterns over the mountainous terrain, while ground teams followed every trail and logging road in the area. Cave systems were explored and abandoned buildings were searched, but no trace of the twins was found. The media attention intensified as the story captured national interest. The Henderson family appeared on television, pleading for their son's safe return while offering a reward for information leading to their recovery. The camp's reputation suffered as parents questioned whether their own children were safe at Wildwood. Enrollment dropped significantly in subsequent years as families chose other facilities for their summer programs. After 2 weeks of intensive searching with no results, the official search was scaled back to periodic sweeps of the area. The case remained open, but investigators had exhausted their leads and resources. The Henderson family refused to give up hope, continuing to search on their own and maintaining a presence at the camp even after other families had departed. The twins' disappearance changed Camp Wildwood forever. The carefree atmosphere that had defined the facility for decades was replaced by strict security protocols and constant supervision. Children were no longer allowed to move freely around the property, and all activities were closely monitored by multiple staff members. The magic that had made Wildwood special seemed to die with the twins vanishing. What no one knew was that the answer to the mystery lay hidden just feet away from where the search had begun, locked away behind the wooden walls of Cabin 7, waiting for someone to discover the truth that would finally explain what happened to Marcus and Matthew Henderson on that fateful summer night 12 years ago. Years passed, and Camp Wildwood struggled to survive the shadow cast by the Henderson twins' disappearance. Enrollment plummeted as parents chose safer alternatives, and the once thriving summer program barely managed to keep its doors open. Robert Walsh aged visibly under the weight of what had happened on his watch. The man who had once greeted every family with enthusiasm and confidence now seemed haunted by questions he couldn't answer. The camp limped along for several more seasons, operating at less than half capacity, with a skeleton crew of counselors and drastically reduced programming. The carefree atmosphere that had defined Wildwood for decades was replaced by rigid protocols and constant supervision. Children were never allowed to be alone, even for a moment, and activities that had once been highlights of the camp experience were eliminated due to safety concerns. Derek Martinez never returned to Camp Wildwood after that summer. The young man who had dreamed of a career in outdoor education found himself unable to work with children. The guilt and trauma of losing the twins under his watch drove him to abandon his studies and take a job in construction. Far from any summer camps or youth programs, he rarely spoke about what happened that night. But those who knew him said he was never the same. The Henderson family's lives were shattered in ways that extended far beyond the obvious grief. David Henderson sold the family farm, unable to bear the memories of his sons playing in the fields and swimming in the pond. Susan Henderson required extensive therapy and medication to cope with the loss, but neither parent ever stopped believing their boys might somehow return home. They kept the twins' bedroom exactly as it had been on the day they left for camp. Local law enforcement continued to investigate sporadically, following up on tips and reported sightings, but the leads always proved false. The case file grew thick with witness statements, search reports, and forensic analyses, but no solid evidence ever emerged to explain what had happened to Marcus and Matthew. The investigation became a cautionary tale about how children could simply vanish without a trace, even under supposedly safe conditions. The FBI maintained their involvement for 3 years before officially closing the case. Due to lack of evidence, the federal agents had pursued every possible angle, from kidnapping to accidental death, to the possibility that the twins had run away voluntarily, But 12-year-old boys don't simply disappear into thin air without leaving some kind of trail. The case defied explanation and haunted everyone who worked on it. In 2015, Robert Walsh made the difficult decision to close Camp Wildwood permanently. The financial losses had become unsustainable, and the emotional toll on remaining staff members was too great. The camp that had once been a beacon of joy and adventure had become a place of sorrow and fear. Walsh held a small ceremony for the few families who still supported the camp, officially ending an era that had lasted nearly 4 decades. The property sat empty for several years, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness that surrounded it. Vandals occasionally broke into buildings, but there was little of value to steal or destroy. The cabins began to show signs of neglect, with loose boards and broken windows, while vines and weeds crept up the walls. Nature seemed determined to erase the traces of human presence from this place of tragedy. In 2018, a real estate developer purchased the Camp Wildwood property with plans to build luxury vacation homes for wealthy city dwellers seeking mountain retreats. The developer saw opportunity where others saw only heartbreak and was eager to capitalize on the pristine wilderness location. Despite its troubled history, the project would require extensive renovation and construction, but the profit potential was enormous. The development company hired local contractors to assess the existing buildings and determine which structures could be salvaged. Most of the cabins were in poor condition after years of abandonment, but some showed potential for conversion into guest cottages or storage facilities. The main lodge was structurally sound and could serve as a clubhouse for the planned residential community. Among the contractors hired for the project was Mike Chen, a local carpenter who had grown up in the area and remembered the Henderson twins' disappearance. Chen had been a teenager when the boys vanished, and the story had fascinated him for years. He had followed the investigation closely and always wondered what had really happened that night. The opportunity to work on the old camp property felt like a chance to finally see the place where the mystery had begun. Chen was assigned to evaluate Cabin 7, the same cabin where the Henderson twins had been staying when they disappeared. The building had suffered more damage than some of the others, with significant water damage from roof leaks and structural issues that would require major repairs. As Chen examined the cabin's interior, he noticed something that caught his attention. The walls of Cabin 7 were constructed differently from the other buildings, instead of standard framing. The cabin had been built with a double wall system, creating a narrow space between the inner and outer walls. Chen assumed this was an attempt at better insulation, but as he investigated further, he realized the construction was unusual and possibly added after the original building was completed. Using a stud finder, Chen discovered that the wall cavity between the boys' sleeping area and the counselor's room was larger than it should have been. Standard construction practices would have left only a few inches of space, but his measurements suggested a gap of nearly 2 feet. Chen's curiosity was piqued by this architectural anomaly, and he decided to investigate further. The carpenter made a small hole in the interior wall, using a drill and flashlight to peer into the hidden space. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cavity contained what appeared to be a makeshift room, complete with blankets, water containers, and food supplies. Someone had created a secret hiding place inside the walls of Cabin 7, a hiding place that had existed during the summer when the Henderson twins disappeared. Chen immediately stopped work and called the sheriff's department, explaining what he had discovered. The responding deputy initially seemed skeptical, but became very interested when Chen mentioned the connection to the missing twins case within hours. The old camp property was once again swarming with law enforcement officers, this time focused on the secret room hidden inside cabin. 7 Detective Sarah Mills had been a rookie officer when the Henderson twins disappeared and had always regretted not being more involved in the original investigation. Now a veteran detective with 20 years of experience, she was determined to finally solve the case that had haunted her department for over a decade. Mills carefully supervised the opening of the wall cavity, documenting everything with photographs and video. The hidden room was approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 7 feet high, barely large enough for an adult to stand upright. The space had been accessed through a removable panel in the counselor's room, disguised to look like part of the original wall construction. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this secret space and had provisioned it for extended occupation. Inside the hidden room, investigators found disturbing evidence that someone had been living there during the summer of 2009. Sleeping bags showed signs of use, water containers held stagnant liquid, and food wrappers bore expiration dates from that year. Most chilling was a collection of photographs showing campers engaged in daily activities around the property, including several images of the Henderson twins. The photographs had been taken with a telephoto lens from various vantage points around the camp, showing children swimming, hiking, and participating in group activities. The images were focused particularly on young boys and seemed to have been taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. The collection represented months of surveillance and planning by someone with access to the camp property. Detective Mills realized that the Henderson twins' disappearance had not been a random tragedy or accident. Someone had been watching the camp, systematically documenting the daily routines of counselors and campers while living secretly in the walls of Cabin 7. The person had been close enough to hear conversations, learn schedules, and plan whatever had happened to Marcus and Matthew. The investigation took on new urgency as Mills assembled a team of forensic specialists to process the hidden room. DNA evidence was collected from the bedding and personal items, while fingerprint experts dusted every surface for traces of the room's occupant. The photographs were sent to the FBI for analysis, hoping to identify the camera used and possibly trace it back to its owner. The discovery of the secret room answered some questions about the Henderson twins' disappearance, while raising many others. It explained how someone could have monitored the camp so closely and known exactly when the twins would be vulnerable, but it didn't reveal the identity of the person who had been hiding in the walls, or what had ultimately happened to Marcus and Matthew. Local residents were shocked to learn that someone had been living secretly at the camp during the summer of 2009. The revelation that the twins' disappearance had been planned rather than random made the crime even more horrifying. Parents who had sent their children to Camp Wildwood during that period wondered if their own kids had been watched and photographed by the hidden predator. The Henderson family was notified about the discovery and traveled to North Carolina to meet with investigators. David and Susan Henderson had aged dramatically in the 12 years since their sons disappeared, but the new evidence gave them hope that they might finally learn what had happened. The couple had never stopped believing that someone had taken their boys, and the secret room seemed to confirm their suspicions. Detective Mills faced the challenging task of identifying who had built and occupied the hidden room. The construction would have required carpentry skills and access to building materials during the camp's operational season. It also would have needed someone with detailed knowledge of the cabin's layout and the ability to work without being detected by staff or campers. The investigation expanded to include background checks on everyone who had worked at Camp Wildwood during the years leading up to the twins' disappearance. Maintenance staff, former counselors, and even vendors who had regular access to the property were scrutinized for any connection to the secret room construction. The list of potential suspects was long, but Mills was determined to follow every lead. As word spread about the discovery, reporters began arriving at the old camp property, once again drawn by the possibility that the Henderson twins case might finally be solved. The story captured national attention, just as it had 12 years earlier, but this time there was tangible evidence to investigate rather than just theories and speculation. The secret room had preserved a snapshot of criminal planning that had remained hidden for over a decade. Whoever had built it had intended to use it for surveillance, and possibly worse, the discovery represented a breakthrough in one of the region's most notorious unsolved cases. But it also raised terrifying questions about what else might be hidden in the walls of seemingly innocent buildings. Mills knew that solving the Henderson twins case would require more than just finding the secret room. She needed to identify its occupant and determine what had happened during those final hours when Marcus and Matthew vanished. The answers were out there waiting to be discovered, but time was running out as memories faded and the evidence deteriorated. The hidden room in Cabin 7 had kept its secrets for 12 long years, but now those secrets were finally beginning to emerge, and with them the truth about what had really happened to the Henderson twins on that summer night in 2009, when two innocent boys walked into the darkness and never returned. The forensic team worked methodically through the hidden room, extracting every piece of evidence that might reveal the identity of its occupant. Detective Mills supervised the process personally, knowing that this discovery represented the best chance they had ever had to solve the Henderson twins case. The room had been sealed for 12 years, preserving evidence that might otherwise have been lost to time and weather. DNA samples were collected from the bedding, clothing, fibers, and personal items found in the space. The state crime lab rushed the analysis, knowing the significance of the case. After days of testing, the results came back with a partial DNA profile that didn't match anyone in the criminal database, but it was enough to potentially identify a suspect. If investigators could find someone to compare it against, the photographs found in the room told a disturbing story of obsessive surveillance spanning several months before the twins disappeared. The images showed detailed documentation of camp routines, including when counselors conducted cabin checks, when children were left unsupervised, and which areas of the property were most isolated. The photographer had been methodical in their planning, studying every aspect of camp life. FBI behavioral analysts reviewed the evidence and developed a psychological profile of the person responsible. They described someone with advanced planning skills who was comfortable working alone and had likely been watching the camp for an extended period. The hidden room construction required carpentry knowledge and access to tools, suggesting someone with building experience or connections to the construction industry. The investigation revealed that Cabin 7 had undergone renovations during the winter of 2008. Just months before the twins arrived at camp, the work had been done by a local contractor who had bid significantly lower than his competitors, raising questions about whether the secret room had been built during this renovation period. Detective Mills obtained the construction records and began tracking down everyone involved in the project. Thomas Brennan had been the general contractor for the Cabin 7 renovation. A quiet man in his 50s who lived alone on a remote property about 10 miles from the camp, Brennan had a reputation for quality work. But some locals described him as odd and antisocial. He rarely spoke to neighbors and was known to watch children from a distance at community events. Mills and her team obtained a search warrant for Brennan's property and made the drive to his isolated home on a gray October morning. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by dense forest, with no neighbors within sight. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home, but there was no answer when deputies knocked on the door. The search of Brennan's property revealed a workshop filled with carpentry tools and building materials, including lumber that appeared to match the wood used in the cabin. 7 secret room. More disturbing were the photographs found in Brennan's bedroom. Dozens of images of children taken at various locations around the county, including several at Camp Wildwood, dating back years before the twins disappeared. Hidden in a locked toolbox, investigators found a journal documenting Brennan's obsession with the camp and its young campers. The entries revealed a disturbed individual who had been planning something for months. The final entry was dated July 14, 2009, just one day before the Henderson twins vanished, and it contained a chilling message about finally taking action. The journal entries painted a picture of a man who had been watching Camp Wildwood for years, learning the routines and identifying vulnerable targets. Brennan had written extensively about individual campers, describing their personalities, habits, and daily schedules with disturbing detail. The Henderson twins were mentioned frequently, with Brennan noting their isolation from other children and their trusting nature. DNA evidence collected from Brennan's home matched the partial profile found in the secret room, confirming that he had been the person living in the walls of Cabin 7 during the summer of 2009, but Brennan himself was nowhere to be found. Neighbors reported that they hadn't seen him in several days, and his truck was missing from the property. An all-points bulletin was issued for Thomas Brennan's arrest on charges related to the Henderson twins' disappearance. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the region, and the FBI added him to their most wanted list. The manhunt focused on areas where Brennan might have contacts or hiding places, but he seemed to have vanished as completely as the twins had 12 years earlier. The discovery of Brennan's identity provided answers to some questions, while raising others. Investigators now knew who had been watching the camp and had likely taken the twins, but they still didn't know what had happened to Marcus and Matthew, or where their remains might be found. The search for the twins took on new urgency, as Mills hoped Brennan might still be alive to provide answers. Brennan's background revealed a history of concerning behavior that had been overlooked by authorities. He had been questioned about suspicious activities near schools on several occasions, but had never been charged with any crimes. His carpentry skills had given him access to various properties where he might have hidden evidence or even victims. The investigation into Brennan's past uncovered connections to other missing children cases in the region over the previous decade. While none had been definitively linked to him, the pattern was disturbing enough to warrant a comprehensive review of unsolved disappearances. Mills realized they might be dealing with a serial predator who had been operating undetected for years. 3 days after the search warrant was executed, Brennan's truck was found abandoned on a Forest Service road about 50 miles from his home. The vehicle had been there for several days, according to park rangers who patrolled the area. Search teams immediately deployed to comb the surrounding wilderness, looking for any sign of the fugitive. The truck contained additional evidence linking Brennan to the Henderson twins case, including camping gear that could have been used to transport the boys and personal items that appeared to belong to children. Investigators found a detailed map of the area around Camp Wildwood with various locations marked in red ink suggesting possible burial sites or hiding places. K-9 units were brought in to search the areas marked on Brennan's map, but the passage of 12 years had made the task extremely difficult. Any scent trails would have long since disappeared, and weather would have scattered or destroyed physical evidence. The search teams focused on areas that might have been suitable for concealing bodies, looking for disturbed soil or unusual vegetation patterns. Local volunteers joined the renewed search effort, many of them parents who had been following the case since the twins first disappeared. The Henderson family traveled to North Carolina to participate in the search. Despite the emotional toll of revisiting the site where their sons had vanished, they remained determined to find answers, even if those answers brought painful closure. The search expanded to include properties where Brennan had worked over the years. Investigators obtained warrants to excavate areas where he might have buried evidence or victims. The process was painstaking and emotionally difficult, as teams used ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to identify potential grave sites. On the 5th day of the search, a team working near an abandoned logging camp made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Buried beneath a pile of rotting lumber, they found a small metal box containing personal items that belonged to the Henderson twins. The box held Marcus's camp identification bracelet, Matthew's inhaler, and several photographs of the boys taken during their stay at Wildwood. The discovery of the buried box proved that Brennan had indeed taken the twins and had kept souvenirs of his crime, but it still didn't reveal what had happened to the boys themselves or where their remains might be found. The evidence suggested that Brennan had been methodical in concealing his activities, but investigators hoped he might have made mistakes that would lead them to the twins' DNA evidence from the buried box confirmed the connection to the Henderson twins and provided additional samples that might help identify other victims. If Brennan had been involved in other disappearances, the investigation was expanding beyond just the twins' case, as authorities realized they might be dealing with crimes spanning many years. The psychological profile of Brennan was updated based on the new evidence. Behavioral analysts described someone who took trophies from his victims and was likely to have established a pattern of behavior that included specific burial or disposal methods. The hidden room at camp had been just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that had operated in secret for years. As the search for Thomas Brennan continued, investigators received a break when a gas station security camera captured footage of someone matching his description purchasing supplies 3 days after his truck was found. The timestamp showed he was still in the area and possibly hiding in the vast wilderness that surrounded the region. The manhunt intensified with additional resources deployed to search the mountainous terrain where Brennan might be hiding. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the area, while ground teams followed every trail and logging road. The fugitive had intimate knowledge of the region from his years of construction work and could potentially evade capture for an extended period. Mills coordinated the search efforts while continuing to process evidence from Brennan's property and the buried box. Every piece of evidence brought them closer to understanding what had happened to the Henderson twins. But the most important questions remained unanswered. Where were Marcus and Matthew, and was Thomas Brennan still alive to tell their story? The investigation had transformed from a cold case into an active manhunt with national implications. If Brennan was responsible for other disappearances, his capture could solve multiple cases and bring closure to families who had been waiting years for answers. The stakes had never been higher. As law enforcement agencies across the region joined the search, local communities were on high alert as news of the manhunt spread. Parents kept their children closer to home, and schools implemented additional security measures. The revelation that a predator had been operating in their midst for years was terrifying, but also brought hope that justice might finally be served. The Henderson family remained at the center of the investigation, their long ordeal finally approaching what they hoped would be resolution. David and Susan Henderson had endured 12 years of uncertainty, but the discovery of their son's personal items in the buried box had confirmed their worst fears while providing the evidence needed to pursue justice. Detective Mills knew that finding Thomas Brennan was crucial, not just for solving the Henderson twins case, but for preventing future crimes. The man had demonstrated a level of planning and patience that made him extremely dangerous. If he remained free, he might strike again or simply disappear forever, taking his secrets with him. The search for Brennan would continue until he was found dead or alive, but the investigation had already achieved something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. It had finally identified the person responsible for the Henderson twins' disappearance and provided their family with answers they had been seeking for over a decade. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning when a hunter stumbled across what appeared to be a makeshift campsite deep in the national forest. The site had been abandoned recently, with still warm ashes in a fire pit and fresh food scraps scattered around the area. When park rangers investigated, they found evidence that someone had been living there for several days, possibly weeks. Detective Mills arrived at the scene within hours, her heart racing as she surveyed the campsite. Among the debris, investigators found several items that linked the site directly to Thomas Brennan. A carpenter's tool belt hung from a tree branch, and a notebook contained handwritten entries that matched Brennan's writing style from the journal found at his home. But it was what they found buried beneath the campsite that would finally answer the question that had haunted everyone for 12 years. Using ground-penetrating radar, the search team identified an anomaly in the soil about 50 yards from the main camp area. The excavation began immediately, with forensic specialists working carefully to preserve any evidence. 24 hours later, the remains of Marcus and Matthew Henderson were finally recovered. The twins had been buried together in a shallow grave, wrapped in camping blankets that matched those found in Brennan's abandoned truck. After 12 years of wondering, their parents finally knew where their sons were. The forensic examination revealed that both boys had died from blunt force trauma, likely within hours of their disappearance from Camp Wildwood. The medical examiner determined that they had been killed quickly, which provided some small comfort to their grieving family. The evidence suggested that Brennan had lured the twins from their cabin, possibly claiming their parents had been in an accident and needed them to come quickly. The discovery of the twins' remains intensified the manhunt for Thomas Brennan. Helicopters circled the area where the campsite had been found, while hundreds of searchers combed through the dense forest. Brennan knew the terrain intimately from his years of construction work in the region, but he was also a 50-something man who had been living rough in the wilderness for weeks. 3 days after the twins' remains were discovered, a park ranger spotted smoke rising from a remote valley about 10 miles from the abandoned campsite. When search teams reached the location, they found Thomas Brennan sitting by a small fire, apparently waiting for them. He offered no resistance when deputies approached, simply nodding when they informed him he was under arrest for the murders of Marcus and Matthew Henderson. Brennan's capture brought an end to one of the most intensive manhunts in the region's history. He was transported to the county jail, where he was held without bail pending formal charges. The man who had terrorized a community and destroyed a family appeared broken and defeated, aged far beyond his years by weeks of hiding in the wilderness. During his initial interrogation, Brennan confessed to killing the Henderson twins, providing details that only the perpetrator could have known. He described how he had spent months planning the crime, using his access to the camp during the renovation project to build a secret room and study the daily routines of counselors and campers. The confession revealed the full scope of Brennan's disturbed mindset. He had become obsessed with the idea of taking children from their families, viewing himself as someone who could provide them with a better life away from what he perceived as an uncaring world. The Henderson twins had been targeted because they seemed lonely and isolated, making them perfect victims in his twisted logic. But the confession also revealed something that horrified investigators even more. Brennan admitted to killing other children over the years, describing at least 4 additional victims whose disappearances had never been connected to a single perpetrator. The scope of his crimes was far greater than anyone had imagined. The revelation that Brennan was a serial killer sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the region. Cold cases dating back 15 years were reopened as investigators looked for connections to the soft-spoken carpenter who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The Henderson family finally had the answers they had been seeking for 12 years, but the knowledge came with a terrible price. Learning the details of their son's final hours was almost unbearable, even as it provided the closure they had desperately needed. David and Susan Henderson held each other and wept as Detective Mills briefed them on Brennan's confession. The twins were laid to rest in a private ceremony attended by family members and close friends. The media attention that had followed the case for over a decade was finally put aside as the Henderson family grieved for their sons and began the long process of healing from their traumatic ordeal. Thomas Brennan was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of Marcus and Matthew Henderson. He also received additional life sentences for the other children he had killed, ensuring that he would never again pose a threat to any family. The case changed how summer camps across the country approached security and background checks. The revelation that a predator had been able to operate undetected for so long led to new protocols for monitoring camp facilities and conducting more thorough investigations of anyone with access to children. Camp Wildwood itself was never rebuilt. The property was eventually donated to the state and turned into a nature preserve, with a small memorial marking the location where the Henderson twins had spent their final days. The memorial serves as a reminder that even in places that seem safe, dangers can lurk in the shadows. Detective Mills continued her career in law enforcement, specializing in cold cases involving missing children. She credited the Henderson twins case with teaching her the importance of never giving up, even when a case seemed hopeless. The secret room in Cabin 7 had kept its secrets for 12 years, but persistence and new evidence had finally brought justice. The discovery of the hidden room changed everything, proving that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we think. For the Henderson family, finding their sons brought an end to 12 years of uncertainty and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The twins were finally home, and Thomas Brennan would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. The case of the Henderson twins serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of eventually coming to light. Their story will be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as proof that justice, however delayed, can still be served.